All right, if you guys would stand with us, we're going to sing Come Ye Sinners, Poor and Needy. This is 420 in your hymnal, or you can look at it on the screen. Come ye sinners, poor and needy, weak and wounded, sick and sore. Jesus ready stands to save you, full of pity, love, and power. I will arise and go to Jesus. He will embrace me in his arms, in the arms of my dear Savior. Oh, there are 10,000 charms. Come ye thirsty, come and welcome God's free bounty glorified. True belief and true repentance, every grace that brings you nigh. I will arise and go to Jesus. He will embrace me in his arms, in the arms of my dear Savior. Oh, there are 10,000 charms. Come ye weary, heavy laden, lost and ruined by the fall. If you tarry till you're better, you will never come at all. I will arise and go to Jesus. He will embrace me in his arms, in the arms of my dear Savior. Oh, there are 10,000 charms. Let not conscience make you linger, nor for fitness fondly dream. All the fitness ye requireth is to feel your need of him. I will arise and go to Jesus. He will embrace me in his arms, in the arms of my dear Savior. Oh, there are 10,000 charms. All right, now we're going to take it up a notch. We're going to go to God of Wonders. This is going to be number 51 in your hymnal. It's just like the one you've heard on the radio, except for we cut the ending a little short. Lord of all creation, of water, earth, and sky, the heavens are your tabernacle. Glory to the Lord on high. God of wonders beyond the galaxy, you are holy, holy. The universe declares your majesty. You are holy, holy, Lord
declares your majesty. You are holy, holy, Lord of heaven and earth, Lord of heaven and earth. Hallelujah to the Lord of heaven and earth. Hallelujah to the Lord of heaven and earth. Hallelujah to the Lord of heaven and earth. God of wonders beyond our galaxy, you are holy, holy. The universe declares your majesty. You are holy, holy, holy.
All right, our next song we're going to be doing in Can It Be? It's number 250, where you can hear it on your screen. Hear it on your screen. That's how I'm doing this morning, guys.
Can it be that I should gain an interest in the Savior's blood? Died he for me who caused his pain, for me winning to death pursued. Amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, should die for me? Amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, should die for me? That he left his Father's throne above, so free, so infinite his grace, emptied himself of all but love, for bled for Adam's helpless race. 'Tis mercy all immense and free. Oh, praise my God, it reaches me. Amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, should die for me? On my presence spirit lay, that's bound in sin and nature's night. But light diffused a quickening light. I woke the dungeon flame with light. My chains fell off, my heart was free. I rose and forth and followed thee. Amazing love, how can it be that thou, my love, should die for me? No condemnation now I dread. Jesus and all in his is mine. Alive in him, I'm living dead, and clothed in righteousness divine. Oh, I approach his eternal throne, and claim the crown through Christ my own. Amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, should die for me?
All right. You may be seated. We're going to have our scripture reading and prayer time.
Good morning. Welcome to God's house. We're going to be in 1 Samuel today, and some of the latter verses of 1 Samuel. Now, the book originally included both 1 and 2 Samuel, but it's pretty easy to tell the differentiation between the two, because in about 10 chapters, both Saul and Jonathan will be dead. And the remaining part of the book, all of 2 Samuel, is going to deal with David. But we're given a view of David in 1 Samuel, because if you've ever read it, you've probably noticed it's David running from Saul, and Saul pursuing David, and David running from Saul, and Saul pursuing David, and that's where we're going to be today. But we also need to understand that in Jesus' time, and we talked about it in our Sunday school class, Jesus is going to quote the Old Testament at least 78 times when he delivers his gospel message. One of those passages is going to have its foundation in what we're going to read here in 1 Samuel. So we're going to be in 1 Samuel, and we're going to read 1 Samuel 21, verses 1 through 9. David went to Nob, to Ahimelech, the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he met him and asked, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" David answered Ahimelech, the priest, "The king charged me with certain matters and said to me, 'No one is to know anything about your mission and your instruction. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever you can find.' But the priest answered David, 'I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women.' David replied, 'Indeed, women have been kept from us, as usual whenever I set out. The men's things are holy, even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today?' So the priest gave them the consecrated bread, since there is no bread there except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away. Now one of Saul's servants was there that day, detained before the Lord. He was Doeg the Edomite, Saul's head shepherd. David said to Ahimelech, 'Don't you have a spear or a sword here?' 'I haven't brought my sword or any other weapons, because the king's business was urgent.' The priest replied, 'The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed, is in the valley of Elah, is here. It is wrapped in cloth behind the ephod. If you want it, take it. There is no sword here but that one.' David said, 'There is nothing like it. Give it to me.'" Father God, thank you for sustenance, Father. Thank you for the sustenance of your servant David. Thank you for the sustenance, Father, of all here, Father. It is you who provides all things, Father. We will see, Father, in your message, Father, it is through your Sabbath rest, Father, that all is provided. I pray, Father, we'd continue to remember that, Father, and remind those around us. And I pray these things in your Son's name. Amen.
All right, if you guys would join me in Luke 6, the opening verses, we're going to talk about Jesus, the Lord of the Sabbath. The whole story here brings to a head the conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees. Jesus and the Pharisees have been sort of building up tension this whole time. But if we track it closely, the Pharisees were not openly opposed to Jesus. At first, they sort of start feeling him out. They start seeing who he is, why this man is getting such a groundswell of attention. Then, in Jesus' sermon in this first synagogue, this was at his hometown, and the people he's initially rejected by are his hometown friends and family. There's actually no Pharisees there that we know of, or at least they're not mentioned, that deny Jesus per se, but it's actually his hometown. Then Jesus, he moves on from his hometown into the surrounding area, and he starts doing miraculous things like healing a leper. Now, the people that witnessed Jesus healing the leper, it says specifically that Pharisees were there, that the scribes and the Pharisees were there, but they didn't come to catch him in error. They came, and what they saw displeased them, but they didn't come to catch him in error. They see him in, you can see this in Luke 5:17, where the leper is healed. They do call him a heretic for what he claimed to do, for being able to forgive a man of his sins, for being able to heal, for even doing these things sort of as confirming statements about himself. But they didn't come to catch him in his error. They question who he dines with in the next the next story. They're looking at, why do you eat with sinners and tax collectors, and why is it that your disciples, your holy men don't look like our holy men? They don't fast. They are questioning the disciples' sense of liberty. And again, in this passage, you'll see the disciples' sense of liberty is questioned. They're walking through a grain field, and they're picking heads of wheat, and they're eating them, and they're doing this on the Sabbath. So the Pharisees see this as a form of work. And again, their sense of liberty is questioned. We'll see here that Jesus then goes and speaks in a synagogue where it says specifically that they watched him closely so that they might have reason to accuse him. So this conflict between the Pharisees has gone from sort of indifference or maybe slight sort of interest. They're not out to get him, but they're out to observe and examine him. They start to dislike his claims of being God, of being the Messiah figure. Then they dislike his disciples. They dislike their sense of liberty. They dislike their practice. And then Jesus, they dislike him ultimately. The reason they start plotting against him is because of what he does on the Sabbath and what he claims to do according to the Sabbath. Basically, the authority he claims over the Sabbath. This statement, Jesus, the Lord of the Sabbath, it really is quite the feisty claim from a man who's supposed to be some kind of a hybrid between a Care Bear and a hippie, right? Jesus, he would never want to have conflict with anyone. You'll see here actually that Jesus picks the fight here, that he heals the man in the synagogue on the Sabbath to provoke, to teach, to test and reveal his watchers. Both good and bad, Jesus is doing this to really help people understand their own position on him. And truly to clarify who he is to his followers. So if you'll join me in Luke 6, verse 1, we'll read through the entire passage, and then we'll sort of go back through it and pull a couple of things out that we can get through from this. Now it happened, so we're in Luke 6:1. Now it happened when he was passing through some grain fields on the Sabbath, his disciples were picking heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands, and eating the grain. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why do you do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus was answering them. He said, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for any to eat except the priests alone, and gave it to his companions. And he was saying to them, Son of Man, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." And verse 6 says, "On the Sabbath he entered the synagogue, and he was teaching, and there was a man there whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he healed on the Sabbath, so that they might find reason to accuse him. But he knew what they were thinking. And he said to the man with a withered hand, 'Get up and come forward.' And he got up and came forward, And Jesus said to them, I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it? After looking around at them all, he said to them, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they themselves were filled with rage and discussed together what they might do to Jesus. The Pharisees are filled with rage, and they start plotting. This happens to be the last time we see at least, that Jesus speaks in a synagogue until Luke 13, where he does this again. He heals on the Sabbath again, and that's it. He's kicked out of the synagogue. And so sometimes we think about Jesus sort of like John the Baptist, like he's roaming the hills and preaching sermons. Jesus is really sort of he's an ostracized synagogue teacher. He goes to the synagogues, he's reaching out to his people, he's reaching out to the Jews, he's going to where the Torah is most respected, and he's constantly trying to show them how he's the fulfillment of the law, how he's the fulfillment of their expectations, and it's from there that he's cast out, and it's from there that people start plotting his death. So we're going to go through this and sort of look for three overarching points. First of all, the point that we're going to look at is the new versus the old. Now, this is coming from our last sermon where Jesus gives the parable of the wineskins. You don't take a patch from an old cloth and destroy the new cloth and put it on the old cloth to patch it up. First of all, they don't match. And secondly, you've destroyed the new cloth. And thirdly, you're going to destroy the old cloth by patching it with the new cloth because the new cloth will shrink and destroy both, right? So the old and the new. In Jesus, for some reason, in some ways, they don't match. Then in the new wineskins and the new wine, Jesus is the new wine. If you try to pour the new wine into the old wineskins will burst, and the new wine will be destroyed in the process. You have to put new wine in new wineskins. Jesus is saying that I need my own structures for my new kingdom, my new age of salvation. I need my own structures to build what I'm doing. And then he actually critiques them and speaks ironically in the final verse of Luke 5, he says, and some will say that when they've tried the old wine, that the old is better. They don't even bother trying the new. Basically, he's saying, you people are so obsessed with your old ways, with your old structures, that you won't even try me. You won't even try me and my salvation. And so going into this, immediately following that parable, Jesus sort of works with this new versus old dichotomy, and it's a little interesting. There's a lot more continuity here than I would have expected, personally. And so if you look at it, the question here really centers around what is lawful on the Sabbath. The disciples, that's what they're called. Sorry, guys. The disciples are picking heads of grain as they walk through fields. Now, if you look at Deuteronomy 23:25, and there's other verses like it, I'm not going to go there today, but if you're curious if this is lawful or not, first of all, it was lawful to pick grain in other people's fields. Israel had set up a really cool system of sort of a bit of a social security net that you still have to work for. If you owned fields and if you reaped grain on your land, you weren't allowed to harvest the corners of your fields. You weren't allowed to harvest the entirety of your yield. You were supposed to leave some so that the poor could come in and pick for themselves food. Now, they were allowed to eat to their fill, but they weren't allowed to take a sickle and store up for themselves food. So they could live hand to mouth based off of what you've left for people, and this maybe had an effect that it made the reserves last longer term. There wasn't hoarding. There wasn't selfishness really beyond somebody's ability to eat. You were allowed to get what you needed, and you had to leave the rest and come back the next day. You see Old Testament saints like Ruth enjoy this. She was gleaning in Boaz's field. Now the question really, and the debate even among modern scholars, is was this legal on the Sabbath? And really there's no explicit commandment saying not to. And so the Pharisees, apparently in their view, said, yes, it's not allowed. It is labor. You are working. And Jesus apparently disagrees. And so you see that Jesus' companions here, they have a new way of interacting with the law because of who Jesus is. And we can see this from Jesus' response. Because I think it would have been much simpler if Jesus would have just quoted our Deuteronomy verse and said, look, it's legal. Instead, he makes a different point. He makes a point that's almost a little harder to follow, but sort of skips their question and raises a new question. The question is, do these people have a special kind of privileges because of my authority. You see, he brings up this passage that Tom read for us, where David, he and his companions were hungry. They were on the run. They were fleeing a murderous king. And David goes to the tabernacle, and he asks the head priest for food. And he's like, well, we only have the food that's allowed for priests. And David's like, yeah, I want some of that stuff for me and my friends. David, we know, is a man after God's own heart. What is David doing? David is not one to disrespect anything pertaining God unless it's his sexuality. I mean, honestly. But David, he's very reverent when it comes to the Ark of the Covenant, and he wants to build the temple, and he wants to do all these things that honor God. And this is still when David is really in good standings with the Lord. Before he's established as king, he's on the run. He won't even slay his enemy because he won't lay a hand on God's anointed. He is living above reproach in so many ways. Does he morally compromise himself here? I think not. I think David sort of understood himself as something different, as something new, where David looked forward to a Messiah. And of course, at this point in the story, it hadn't been promised to him. But if he's willing to eat the bread that only the priests are allowed to have, does he see himself as some kind of a priest king? I think theologically that's the point we end up on. You know, Moses was supposed to be something like a priest king. He was supposed to lead the people and intercede for them. And why do we get Aaron? Oh, it's because Moses doesn't step up. We get the Levitical, the Aaronic priesthood because Moses says, I'm not articulate. I can't do it. I can't stand in this role. And yet Moses still acts like a priest king in a sense because he does intercede for his people. He chooses not to let God restart the promises with him. And he says, no, forgive them for their sins. Please keep them going. Maintain your promises. Remember your love for them. And in that controversial passage, it says that God does change his mind. You know, that's not the focus of our sermon today, but that's an interesting point, right? Moses chooses to intercede for his people. And then we have another good leader come up. And he does what only priests could do. He eats this consecrated bread. And in the very next passage that we didn't get to read, you can look at it, David, immediately after acting like a priest, gets mistaken for a king by the king of, I think it's Gath, in the following passage, where his enemies say, oh, isn't David the king? Saul has killed his hundreds and David his thousands. I think I reversed the order there, but that's the idea. So David, he's considered a priest, he's acting like a priest, and he's immediately following, he's mistaken for a king. Remember, David is the model that Jesus is stepping into. He's stepping into this type. Not only is there a prophetic promise given to David, but David is the model, literally, of what we're looking for in the new Savior, a priest king that Jesus claims to be. So David gets special kind of rights when it comes to eating the consecrated bread. Jesus is looking at his disciples and saying, given my new status, given who I am, my followers get special status and special authority over different things that they wouldn't have had without me, too. I think this here is really interesting because Jesus' companions, David's companions, first of all, act like priests. They eat the consecrated bread. Jesus' companions live in the liberty and the authority of their leader, Jesus. I think this sets a precedent for what we see with the concept of a priesthood of believers, that when you receive Jesus, you have the Holy Spirit. You have and can do things that really only the priests could do in the Old Testament. You can pray directly to God. You can get an intercession. You can do intercessory prayers for your unbelieving friends and family directly at the throne room of God because of what Jesus did. This is setting up a pretty cool precedent, not simply with Jesus, but what we saw David do. What Jesus sees himself standing in the office of. He says, guys, there's been an implication, there's been a setup for this for a long time. Back to your friends, back to your man David. And so Jesus here, he's saying that his companions get to do something new because of him. He actually circumvents the whole question on whether or not this is legal. Even though he is really picking a legal battle here, he's saying there's a precedent for somebody like a priest king getting to do something new with the law. And so Jesus ends up going in and he heals in the Sabbath in this next paragraph. You see that he's there in the synagogue, he's there on a Sabbath, and he knows the hearts of his people that are there. They're looking for him to do the wrong thing. Ironically, he does the right thing. They're looking for him to do the wrong thing, heal somebody on the Sabbath, and he says, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and do it. And so again, this brings up a question about the law. How does the old and the new work together? You'll see in the Old Testament that there was allowances for well-doing on the Sabbath. Now, this had to do oftentimes with rescuing a deserted animal or an animal that had gotten stuck in a pit or doing something to save a life. And I didn't bring any extra, I didn't bring the direct quotes for you, but you can find it in the footnotes of your Bible, and especially if you go to the other gospel accounts of this, they bring up those points where Luke sort of omits them. And so Jesus, he knows the hearts of the people, and he asks, is it better to do good or to do evil on the Sabbath? Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? And then in the same sentence, he asks the second question that we'll have to get to later. It says to save life or to destroy it. So his understanding of the law is it's always been lawful to do well, to do good on the Sabbath, to save life and preserve it. Well, the man who he heals, he only has a crippled hand. So does Jesus save his life? No, he doesn't, right? He's simply restoring this man's ability. He's restoring his ability to make money, to be part of society. So the Pharisees, they say, well, you didn't do something necessary for saving life, so you've violated the law. And I think Jesus really here is getting to the principle of saying it's always been okay to do well on the Sabbath, right? Jesus ultimately kept the law perfectly. We have to remember that Jesus was the epitome, the fulfillment of the law. So he's not actually disobeying anything on the Sabbath in any of these two instances. But what he's doing here is he's using his understanding of the principles behind the Sabbath law, and he's using it to exploit, maybe not exploit, but expose the evil hearts and the ways these laws had been twisted against the people of God. And so Jesus ultimately kept the law perfectly. He fulfilled and yet sort of abolished the law. You know, there's sort of a problem when you look at, well, did Jesus fulfill the law or did he abolish the law? Jesus says, well, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, right? So his intent, I'd say, was to not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. But in Jesus, ultimately, what we do see is that the law is abolished after it's been perfectly fulfilled, and the one good man, the one perfect man, that none of us are held accountable to the law because none of us were capable, but we are justified perfectly in the law because of Jesus. And I believe you can see that in Romans, I believe it's 10:4, where it talks about that the end of the law is found in Jesus. Next, we're going to look at Jesus as the sovereign good. This story really brings out a lot of Jesus' characteristics. He's picking the fight, he's choosing the battle, and he's doing it for our good. And I'm going to have to get a drink of water here for a second. So Jesus, he steps up to defend his disciples. And how does he do it? He cites verses, right? The lawyers, basically, they say, well, it's not lawful for you to do what you're doing. And they're setting up their own understanding of their own authority over the law. And they're saying, well, we know the law. We have authority over it. We're the masters of the law, actually. What you're doing is not lawful. And so Jesus, the synagogue teacher, he steps up and he defends them with the word and with his person. This is something really cool for us to remember for ourselves. Jesus is always defending us and our accusers with the word and with his person. Jesus is the final authority over the fourth commandment. And that's what you see when he says in verse 5, the Son of Man, which is his self-description, is the Lord of the Sabbath. This word Lord is not a small word for Lord. If you know Greek, or if you have a little Greek dictionary like I do, Kyrios, this is a big word. He is the Lord, he is the authority over the Sabbath. Jesus is the final authority over the fourth of the 10 commandments. Isn't that a big deal? You have the 10 commandments. I have the authority over the aspect of the 10 commandments that makes you a Jew. Ooh, he is making a big claim, right? Jesus gives Torah, he adapts Torah, and he fulfills Torah, right? He is the Word, just like John 1 would say. And so Jesus picks this fight, saying, I am the authority. I am the authority, and I'm going to prove it to you, right? He looks at these people, and he's like, you don't understand. I'm something new. I have brought a new age here. And by the way, I know best. And so his activity in verse 6 and on is interesting. It says, on another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And there was a man whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees were watching closely to see if he healed on the Sabbath, so they might have reason to accuse him. Now, we've already brought up the irony of this verse, right? But it says in verse 8, but he knew what they were thinking. And he said to the man with the withered hand, get up and come forward. This is pretty beautiful in a sense because Jesus knows that these people are out to get him. He knows that it's going to cost him, and he still does the right thing. He still intercedes for the people that he loves. And no, he was not going to save this man's life. But this man's affliction, it still caught Jesus' sympathy. And he was going to take this man's weakness, his deformity, and he was going to make himself glorious on the back end of this man's pain by making him well. This is really great because, if you think about having a deformity, a lot of times people like to hide them. I knew somebody that they just had sort of an extra long index fingernail. It sort of wrapped around their finger. This person was like very, very beautiful, totally gorgeous, but you would see them sort of hold their sweater like this the whole time, just for a fingernail. Now imagine a whole crippled hand in a society where people thought that deformity made you unwell. Deformity made you unclean or sinful. This man had to have that arm stuck in a pocket or stuck in a robe all the time. This was something he hid. And Jesus, knowing that these people were out to get him, says, stand up. Stand up in the assembly of the righteous. We'll just ignore the phone. It's going to go off for a while. Says, stand up, come forward. And he got up and came forward. And Jesus said to them, I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or destroy it? Jesus picks this fight. He practices his authoritative commentary on the Sabbath and reveals his will to do good and to restore. He reveals the hearts of his critics in the process, right? They breathed threats against him on the Sabbath, and that's where the second question that Jesus asks comes in. Is it good to save life or to destroy it? This is actually pointed not at the law, but at his critics. Now, what were they thinking? Is it good to save a life? Well, you're not saving a life. He could live with this. You could save this on Monday. Why are you doing this on Saturday, right? His point is that you guys are plotting to kill me on the Sabbath. What's your problem? You think you're the authority of the Sabbath? You think you're the authority of what makes what makes somebody holy on the Sabbath when you're willing to kill me for doing good? This is really an authoritative message to his critics because it's that second question that's pointed right at them. And their response to him doing good proves the point of his message, that their hearts were already against him and they had already decided to be against him regardless of his actions because of who he claimed to be, because of how he acted as an authority over the Sabbath. And he says, get up, come forward. And he got up and came forward. And Jesus said to them, I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it? In verse 10 it says, after looking around at them all, so he pauses and waits for a response. And there's this weight in the air, that's this rhetorical question if they're not going to answer, apparently. And he says, stretch out your hand. He says, let me show you what's good to do on the Sabbath. Stretch out your hand. So he exposes the deformed hand that he was embarrassed of, that had crippled him, that had taken away probably a lot of his economic possibilities, a lot of his acceptance in the community. He had to have faith in stretching out that hand, and he did so, and he was restored. But they themselves were filled with rage and discussed together what they might do to Jesus. This really gets to Luke's theme here of constantly using Jesus in the narrative to show that really Jesus is a sign to be decided against, right? If you look back at Luke 2:33 through 34, Simeon's prophecy about Jesus, he will be a sign to be opposed. He will be somebody that divides, even dividing your own heart. He talks to Mary, right? The fact that Jesus was a person that people were making decisions on, whether they loved him or they didn't, not based on who he was, but on the status of their heart in the first place, on basically God's electing ability. And so Jesus here, he picks the fight to honor the man in the short term to his own detriment, because these people start breathing threats against him. They start plotting what they might do to him. I want you to notice, though, that up until this point, they had their disagreements, but the Pharisees weren't out to kill him until this moment. By Jesus extending healing to this man and choosing to pick this fight in the short term, he picked the fight for all of us in the long term, and that they started plotting the cross so that he could heal each of us according to his power and authority. Do you see Jesus here as the sovereign good that chooses to glorify himself, to speak highly of himself to his own detriment, to our benefit, for both the short-term and the long-term success of his ministry? There would be, in Luke's narrative at least, no cross without this episode, without Jesus constantly picking the fights for the outcast, for the broken, for the weak. And really it's also because God's pursuit of his own glory. And this is our final point, that Jesus is passionate about his own glory. God is passionate about his own glory. Jesus can't overstate his own worth. He can't speak too highly of himself. Now, I can go to my driver's ed job and say I'm the best driver in the car, and it's an accurate statement. But it would be an inaccurate statement to say I'm the best driver in the world, right? I can possibly speak too highly of myself. Jesus cannot speak too highly of himself. His power and his character and his knowledge surpasses all of us. He is honest and accurate whenever he speaks highly of himself, saying, I'm Lord of the Sabbath, I am God of the 10 Commandments. It's accurate. And he's worthy of praise because he uses his greatness to heal the hopeless like you and me. He uses his greatness to be glorified by saving the least worthy and the least the people that just couldn't do it on their own, like this crippled man or like us. We follow a God who is keen on achieving his own greatness. And a lot of times our knee-jerk reaction is, isn't that arrogant? Well, not really, because we follow a God that is glorious and good. Imagine you start having a heart attack at like a sporting event. You're gasping for air, the pain in your chest is acute, and a bunch of dutiful Boy Scouts come around you, and somebody's got the scout book, and they're like, okay, how do we do CPR? And one guy's holding your mouth open, and another 11-year-old's pushing with all his might down on your chest to try to get a rhythm of compressions going. And there's a doctor in the stands, and somebody cries out, is there a doctor here? Can somebody call a doctor? And the doctor, in their humility, and not wanting to take away the special moment for the Boy Scouts, just decides to sit by and say, you know what, I think I'm going to give the Boy Scouts this. I'd hate to be arrogant in stepping up and taking this moment to save life. No, the doctor is praised, and thank God they're there, because yes, they know the best, and yes, they're in the best hands when that person is willing to step up and take responsibility, right? This is how it is for Jesus. When he speaks highly of himself, he's doing all of us a favor, because he is the greatest man we could ever know. Not just because of his power and ability, but because he always glorifies himself to our benefit. He always glorifies himself to our benefit. And in doing so, amazingly, because of his sovereignty, because of his goodness, because of just how he works, the moment he reveals his goodness to those who would believe, he also disparages his enemies, those who would just reject him outright anyways. It's always revealing their hearts. There's this idea, right, that the gospel, it softens some hearts and it hardens others. And really it's a reflection on us when we respond to the man that is perfectly good and perfectly great. When we see him heal and we hate him anyways, what does that say about you? What does that say about you? And if you find yourself with an unbelieving heart, you have to question yourself. And so if you'll join me at one final verse in Hebrews 3. Hebrews 3:12 talks about this rest, the fact that the Sabbath was meant to be a rest, and it was sort of looking back at the creation story, that it was looking back at sort of living in line with God's creative efforts and living in line with his created order, saying, I need rest, I need time to be with my Creator. The creation needs its time to rest, to recover, all the way from the workers to the livestock to the animals to the vegetation, even in some verses. The Sabbath was part of God's good created order. But it always looked forward to the final rest we'd have with him. And if you'll start with me in Hebrews 3, we're going to start in verse 6. This is sort of after comparing Moses and Jesus. It says, but Christ was as a faithful son over the house, whose house we are, if we hold fast our confidence and the boast of our hope until the end. So we must hold fast our confidence. We must hold fast our belief, our confession of faith. And then it says this, it's quoting the Old Testament. And you'll see in verse 11, it talks about people that abandon God will not enter my rest. They will not enter my ultimate Sabbath, right? And so just keep that in mind as we read this block quote. It says, in verse 7, therefore, just as the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as when they provoked me, as in the day of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tried me by testing me and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I was angry with this generation and said, they will always go astray in their heart, and they did not know my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. So this is a reminder to us that the people that followed Moses, they saw his works, they saw his goodness, and their hearts were hard, and they will not enter my rest. They will not enter the rest of the Lord of the Sabbath. What does it say in this final verse here? Hebrews 3:12. Take care, brethren, that there not be in any one of you an evil, an unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. This is the message to all of us. When Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath, and we're looking forward to the ultimate Sabbath, the ultimate rest that we can have in him, we must maintain our confession of faith. We must fight the trend towards a hardened and unbelieving heart, hardened by the afflictions of the world, hardened by the lies of Satan, hardened by our own personal preference and experience. We must be softened to the gospel because of who Jesus claims to be and what he did for us. We must, in verse 13 and 14, you'll see, depend on each other to maintain that confession of faith. But we must take care that there not be in any one of us an evil and an unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God, but encourage one another day after day, as long as it is still called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ. So we are saved. We have become partakers of Christ. If, conditional statement, if we hold fast the beginnings of our assurance firm until the end. We must maintain our confession of faith. Don't be hardened in your heart when you see God work. Be softened to him. Look at your duty as a Christian to encourage and maintain other people's confession of faith. Remind them of God's goodness. Remind them of his word. Remind them of the Savior that loves them. I'll pray and I'll invite our worship team back up for one last song here. Dear Lord, thank you so much for your patience with us, God, as we doubt. I do believe that it can be providential, Lord. You are a personal God of the universe. God, you help us ask the right questions. But Lord, in our questioning, you also reveal our own hearts. God, I pray that you would help us to defend a firm and loving confession of faith for you, for what you've done and for who you've claimed to be. God, I pray that you'd help us preserve one another in faith. And thank you so much for the rest that we all one day look forward to. Because of your goodness, you have bought it for us and you have invited us in. God, if there is anybody here that does not know you, Lord, I pray that they would grab somebody, that they'd come to me or one of the other many Christians in this room, that they would ask about how to know if they have certainty in you by accepting your Son, Jesus. Amen. All right, if you'll stand with us for our final song. This one's not in your hymnal. It's going to be on the screen. It's Come Behold the Wondrous Mystery. the dawning of the King. He, the theme of heaven's praises, robed in frail humanity. In our longing, in our darkness, now the light of life has come. Look to Christ who condescended, took on flesh and ransomed us. Come behold the wondrous mystery, He the perfect Son of Man. In His living, in His suffering, never trace nor stain of sin. See the true and better Adams come to save the hellbound man. Christ the great and sure fulfillment of the law, in Him we stand. Come behold the wondrous mystery, Christ the Lord upon the tree. In the stead of ruined sinners hangs the Lamb in victory. See the price of our redemption, see the Father's plan unfold, bringing many sons to glory, grace unmeasured, love untold. Behold the wondrous mystery, slain by death, the God of life. But no grave could ever restrain Him. Praise the Lord, He is alive. What a foretaste of deliverance, never wavering our hope. Christ in power resurrected, as we will be when He comes. What a foretaste of deliverance, how unwavering our hope. Christ in power, resurrection, as we will be when He comes. Philip, would you pray to close us?
Absolutely. Heavenly Father, we just praise You, glorify Your name through Your Son, through our Savior and our Lord Jesus. As we leave here today, may we continue to recognize that He is the Lord of the Sabbath, that He's the Lord of the law, the Lord of our hearts, and that we continue to walk through His Spirit so that we can satisfy everything He has called us to. In His precious holy name we pray. Amen.